They gave me a cot in the rear ward, away from the men who still had two good legs, and I spent the first 3 days staring at the ceiling thinking about bones. Not my bones, though those were in enough disarray. I mean the bones I'd found in the rubble of the commissary depot outside Valkenburg 2 weeks before the carnivores arrived at our sector. Big cow femurs, the kind the kitchen staff used for stock. I remember kicking one across the cracked asphalt and thinking, waste. That's a meal. That's protein. That's survival currency if things go sideways. Things went sideways. My name is Corporal Eli Mack, formerly of the 9th Reconnaissance Company, 3rd Human Reclamation Corps. I say formerly because there isn't a 9th Reconnaissance Company anymore. There's me, a field medic named Doris who lost 2 fingers to frostbite in Belgium, and a signals officer named Wren who can't speak above a whisper since the temporal displacement event outside Ghent. The rest are gone. Some died the ordinary way: bullets, collapse, infection. Others are gone in a way that takes longer to explain, and I'll get to that. I'm writing this down because the Corps psychiatrist, a soft-spoken Dutchman named Dr. Havorson, says it will help. He says externalizing the experience creates cognitive distance. He said it with a straight face, which I respect. He's never been in the field, but he's not a fool, and he was honest enough to admit that no therapeutic framework he learned in school accounts for what we've been through. Write it down, he said, as clearly as you can. Leave nothing out. So I'm leaving nothing out, and if some of it sounds impossible, I'd ask you to remember that 3 years ago the concept of a carnivore was itself impossible, and here we are. I'll start where I always start when I'm trying to make sense of it, which is not the beginning, because the beginning was just noise and confusion, and the particular kind of terror that comes when you don't yet understand what you're afraid of. I'll start with the bin. We called it the bin because it was a large rectangular depression in the earth, approximately 4 meters deep and 8 meters wide, that the carnivores had opened up in the plaza outside what used to be the Valkenburg train station. They hadn't dug it. They didn't dig things. It had simply appeared one morning in the 3rd week of October, as if the ground had decided to stop being solid at that particular location. The locals had already evacuated. We inherited the town, which is to say we inherited the bin, the silence, and the cold. Sergeant Acaffer had his team establish a perimeter. I was assigned forward observation, meaning I sat on a pile of rubble with a set of thermoplastic glasses and watched the bin for 8 hours while nothing happened. Then, on the 9th hour, something moved inside it. I want to be careful here because moved isn't quite right. What happened was that the interior of the bin shifted in quality the way a photograph shifts when you tilt it in light. One moment it was a dirt-walled hole in the earth. The next moment it was still a dirt-walled hole in the earth, but the dirt had acquired a different texture, a different color, and the shadows inside it fell at an angle that didn't correspond to the sun's position overhead. Like looking at 2 photographs of the same place taken in different seasons, overlaid. "Mac," said Acaffer over the comm, "talk to me." "Something's happening in the bin," I said. "Not sure what, stand by." "That's not a status report, that's a prayer." "Stand by," I said again. The shifting intensified. The 2 versions of the bin, present, and whatever the other one was, began to separate and recombine like oil and water being stirred. And then the first carnivore came through. I'd seen the briefings, everyone had. The photographs, the artists' renditions, the thermal imaging data from the Oslo incident. I thought I was prepared. I was not prepared. The carnivore was roughly the size of a city bus. If the bus had been constructed from something between amber and smoke, if it had no fixed geometry, if its edges blurred and sharpened as you watched because its actual spatial dimensions fluctuated based on what moment in time it was most fully occupying. That's the part that took longest to understand, and I'll be honest that I still only understand it partially. A carnivore doesn't exist at a single point in time the way you and I do. It exists across a range of moments simultaneously, and the version you see at any given instant is just the cross-section of a much larger temporal body. When one of them moves, It doesn't so much travel through space as it repositions which slice of itself is most present in the current moment. The Oslo researchers called this temporal smearing. I called it deeply wrong. Two more came through the bin behind the first. They emerged slowly, the way deep-sea creatures come up from pressure, carefully, in stages. They oriented themselves, and I could tell they were orienting themselves because the way the air around them distorted would shift and then settle, and then they simply stood there in the plaza for 3 hours and 40 minutes. We did not engage. Our standing orders were clear. Observe, document, report, do not provoke. What are they doing? Akafor asked me. Standing, I said. For what purpose? Sergeant, I cannot tell you what purpose a bus-sized creature from outside of linear time has for standing in a Belgian plaza. I can tell you it is standing. Akafor was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, he said. They left the same way they came. The bin closed like an eye. That was our introduction. From there, the situation degraded at a rate that I think historians will one day describe as unexpectedly rapid, if historians are still a thing. By November, chronivores were opening transit points, the bins. We called them all bins by then regardless of shape, across a band of territory stretching from the Dutch coast to the Swiss border. They weren't colonizing. That's important to understand because we wasted 2 months trying to figure out what resources they wanted, what territory they were claiming, what strategic objectives they were pursuing. The answer, as far as anyone could determine, was none. They were present. They moved through an area. They interacted with the physical world occasionally, in the way that a whale occasionally interacts with a fishing net. Not maliciously, not with intent, but the net comes off worse regardless. The interacting was the problem. When a chronovore's temporal field intersected with a human structure, bad things happened. A building might age 40 years in an afternoon, its mortar crumbling, its steel corroding. A road might revert to its pre-construction state, grass pushing up through the vanished asphalt. Vehicles that drove too close came out wrong, sometimes just aged, sometimes physically altered in ways that suggested the machine had briefly existed in a different technological era. We lost a supply truck that drove through the edge of one's field and came out the other side as something that looked like the idea of a truck, rendered in materials that hadn't been commercially produced since the 1940s. People who got caught in a full temporal intersection didn't come out. They didn't die exactly. They went somewhere. Somewhen. The core xenophysicists who were operating well outside their training, I want to be clear, theorized that the chronovore's fields didn't discriminate between matter and structured information. A human body is matter, but a human consciousness is also structured information, a pattern of firing neurons encoding memory and identity across time. When a chronovore passed close enough, that informational pattern could be extracted, peeled from the present like a label from a bottle, and deposited elsewhere in the timeline. Private Fen Maurice of our company went that way. One moment he was beside me in the rubble of what had been a pharmacy. The next moment there was a brief sound like a film reel being run backward at high speed, and Maurice was gone. The Corps later received reports of a confused young man in military-style clothing who appeared near Bergen, Norway, in what witnesses described as a state of extreme temporal disorientation. He was missing his boots. The man could not say what year he believed it was. He kept asking for Sergeant Akafor. We didn't know at that point that Maurice was recoverable. We counted him among the dead. This is relevant to what comes later. By December, the 9th Recon had shrunk from 22 to 9. Not all to chronovores, the winter was doing its own work, and the supply lines were unreliable, and Corporal Hayes made a mistake with a heating element that he didn't survive. But the chronovores accounted for 4. Maurice, whom we thought dead. Private Yun, who walked into a transit point that opened in the floor of an abandoned church. Private Sedaris, caught in a temporal wash during what should have been a routine observation. And Lieutenant Harmon, our commanding officer, who made the decision to step between the rest of us and an approaching carnivore during the incident at the Moss River crossing, and who bought us approximately 40 seconds with that decision. 40 seconds doesn't sound like much. It was enough to get us across the bridge and into the buildings on the far bank. After Harmon, I was in command. I want to be clear that I was not trained for this. I was not suited for this, and I made mistakes. But I was there and I was upright, and I had not yet lost enough of my mind to be disqualified from exercising what remained of my judgment. The 9 of us, 7, after Yun and Sedaris, settled into a basement on the east side of the river and tried to figure out what we knew. What we knew, carnivores were not territorial, were not aggressive in any intentional sense, but were catastrophically dangerous by proximity. Their transit points were unpredictable. Their temporal fields could age matter, displace objects, and extract human consciousness from its present moment. They did not respond to human communication. They did not appear to perceive human presence except as an obstruction of marginal note, in the way you might perceive a cardboard box in your path, neither maliciously nor with interest. What we did not know, whether there was a command structure, whether they had intent, whether they could be communicated with, whether the displaced people were retrievable, whether there was any way to interrupt or redirect a carnivore's movement that didn't involve standing in front of it. What I personally needed to know, because it was the only question that determined my next decision, was there a central source? Were these individual entities operating on their own, or were they emanating from somewhere? Because if there was a source, you could potentially get to it. And if you could get to it, you could potentially do something. I'm aware this logic sounds thin. I'm aware that potentially do something is not a plan. But we were 7 people in a basement in December with 3 days of rations, and the understanding that if we stayed where we were, we would eventually be displaced, starved, or frozen, and potentially do something was more than we'd had before. Ren, our signals officer, had been tracking the transit point activity on her equipment since the beginning. She'd mapped every bin opening in our sector. She spread the data across the basement floor, hand-drawn on a sheet of packing paper, and pointed to the center of the cluster. "They're all radiating from here," she said. Her voice was fine then. "That came later. 14 kilometers northeast." I looked at the map. "That's the old quarry outside Eppin." "Yes." "What's at the quarry?" "Right now, the largest carnivore field we've recorded. Possibly the origin point, possibly just a gathering." She paused. "We have no way of knowing without going there." The team looked at me. I looked at the map. "All right," I said, "we go there." "To do what?" asked Private Dumont. I was honest. "I don't know yet, but we go there." The 14 kilometers took us 2 days, because we moved slow and we moved careful. The carnivore transit activity increased as we approached the quarry, which meant the temporal interference was worse, and the ground itself became unreliable. We passed through a stretch of forest where the trees were wrong, not visually, but temporally. They were old growth, but the stumps of their predecessors had not yet rotted, and the stumps of their own future felling were visible at the edge of my vision, ghost-like, when I turned too fast. Ren said the equipment was registering temporal density in the area approximately 40 times baseline. Private Aguilar stepped off the path to relieve himself and came back 3 meters to our left, approximately 10 minutes earlier in his personal timeline. He remembered the last 10 minutes. The 10 minutes still happened. There were briefly 2 Aguilars, one of whom had experienced the last 10 minutes and one of whom had not, and we spent 40 terrifying seconds until the past version folded back into the present version, and there was only one again. Aguilar was gray-faced and shaking for an hour after. He didn't step off the path again. We reached the quarry at dusk on the 2nd day. I don't have adequate language for what we found. I'll try to use the words I have. The quarry was a large limestone excavation, perhaps 300 meters across, that had been inactive since the 1970s. What was in it now was not limestone. What was in it now was time. Concentrated time, layered time, time folded over itself like geological strata, except that geological strata are records of the past, and this was the past and the present and something that I can only call the weight of having existed all compressed into the same space. The chronivores were in the quarry. Perhaps 40 of them, perhaps more. It was hard to count because they occupied different slices of the present moment and didn't all align. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns that I gradually recognized as something like communication. The way their temporal fields overlapped and separated and overlapped again. The information being exchanged in a medium I couldn't read. At the center of the quarry, larger than any of the others, older in some way that I felt in my teeth and my joints rather than saw with my eyes, was what I later heard the xenophysicists call the anchor. The anchor didn't move. It was so temporally dense that its edges didn't blur. They were too committed to existing to blur. It occupied the present with the absolute certainty of a mountain. Wren was recording everything. Her hands were steady. I respected that. The displaced people, I said quietly. Harmon, Maurice, Yun, Sedaris. If they were extracted from the present, where are they relative to that thing? Wren looked at her equipment. I don't know, but if temporal density is what I think it is, and if the extraction process works the way the xenophysicists suggested, she paused. They're in there somewhere, or their temporal signatures are, compressed into the field, not dead, just held. Like files on a drive, said Aguilar. That's a crude analogy, Wren said, but not wrong. I stared at the anchor. 40 meters below us, in the quarry floor, a creature the size of a cathedral was sitting at the center of a gathering of its kind, and inside it, or adjacent to it, or folded into it in some way I couldn't fully conceptualize, were the people I'd been unable to save. What would it take to get them out? I asked. To destabilize the anchor's field enough to release the compressed temporal signatures. Wren shook her head. We'd need to introduce a temporal anomaly at the anchor's scale, something that disrupts its coherence. Meaning? Something that doesn't fit, something the anchor can't incorporate, the way a grain of sand disrupts a precision instrument. She looked at her equipment. The chronovore's weakness, if it can be called that, is that their temporal processing is extraordinarily sophisticated but not flexible. They process time the way a very fine watch processes movement. Accurately, consistently, but a very fine watch can be broken by a shock it wasn't designed to absorb. What kind of shock? A paradox, she said. A moment that is simultaneously before and after itself, something causally impossible in linear time. I thought about this for a while. The quarry was quiet. The chronovores moved in their slow, communicating patterns. The anchor did not move at all. Wren, I said, if one of us got close enough to the anchor, close enough to make contact with its field, would we get absorbed the way the others were? Almost certainly. And if we got absorbed, we'd be inside the field, part of its temporal structure. Theoretically. And if we were inside the field, and we acted in a way that created a causal paradox. Wren looked at me for a long time. You'd be creating the disruption from inside, she said. Would it work? I don't know, she paused. I have to be honest with you. The physics involved is beyond my training, beyond anyone's training. There is no precedent for this. But it might work. It might work, she agreed. Or it might kill you, or it might kill the displaced personnel inside the field, or it might destabilize the field in a way that has consequences we can't predict. Right, I said. The thing I didn't say out loud, because I didn't think it would help morale, was that I'd been operating on the theory that doing something, anything, was better than doing nothing. Since the moment in December when Harmon walked forward and bought us 40 seconds, Harmon hadn't known it would work. He just moved toward the problem. I've thought about that a lot since, whether that's wisdom or just momentum, whether there's a difference. I left the team at the quarry's edge and went down alone. I want to be clear that this was not a decision I made lightly, and it was not a decision I made with any particular sense of heroism. It was a practical calculation. One person absorbed by the anchor's field was a problem. 7 people absorbed was a catastrophe. If my plan, such as it was, failed, I needed the rest of the team to still be functional, still be above ground, still be capable of transmitting what they'd observed to someone with more resources and more options. Also, honestly, I was the one who'd walked them 14 kilometers to the edge of a quarry full of temporal entities with a plan that amounted to, "I'll think of something." That made it my responsibility to be the one who tried. The descent was slow. The quarry had old access roads cut into its limestone walls, switchbacking down to the floor. I took them carefully, watching my footing, watching the chronivores. They did not react to my presence. The temporal field grew stronger as I descended. I could feel it in the way my sense of time became imprecise, the way a moment stretched or compressed without warning, the way my memories felt closer to the surface, as if the present were thinning and the past bleeding through. At the quarry floor I stopped. The anchor was perhaps 30 meters away. At this distance, it was not so much visible as felt, a pressure in the chest, a ringing at the frequency of all the time you've ever lived, an awareness of yourself as a creature with a before and an after, and the particular discomfort of standing next to something that has neither. I reached into my jacket pocket. I carry a coin. I have since I was 19 years old when my grandfather pressed it into my hand and told me it was lucky. It's an old silver coin. The denomination is worn smooth, the date unreadable. It might be 50 years old. It might be 100. My grandfather didn't know either. He'd gotten it from someone else, who'd gotten it from someone else, and the chain of getting went back further than any of us could trace. I looked at the coin. I looked at the anchor. Here's the thing about a causal paradox, and Wren had explained this to me once in the context of temporal theory long before any of this mattered practically. A true paradox is not simply something impossible. It's something that is simultaneously its own cause and its own effect, a loop that closes on itself. The classic example is the traveler who goes back in time to give a young inventor the idea for time travel. The idea comes from the future, but the future only exists because of the idea, and neither has an original source. It's a causal structure with no beginning, and this causes problems for any system that requires a beginning. I was going to give the anchor a coin. I was going to give the anchor a coin, and the coin was going to come from inside the anchor's field, because I was going to be inside the anchor's field when I gave it. And the reason the coin was inside the field was because I'd brought it there from outside the field. But if the anchor processed the coin's temporal signature as originating inside its own structure, the coin's existence inside the field would predate the coin's existence outside the field. Which meant the coin would have been in the field before I brought it there, which meant I couldn't have brought it there from outside, which was a loop with no source. It wouldn't be a large paradox. It wouldn't collapse the universe. But it would, if Wren's theory held, be a grain of sand in a very fine watch. I want to be clear that I was not confident this would work. I was not even particularly hopeful. I was tired, I was cold. I was responsible for 6 people at the top of a quarry wall and 4 people somewhere inside a temporal field. And I had been operating for 3 months on insufficient sleep and insufficient food, and the kind of sustained low-level dread that eventually stops feeling like dread and starts feeling like weather. Just the climate you live in, the way the world is now. I walked toward the anchor. The field hit me at perhaps 15 meters. I want to describe what it felt like, but I'm not sure I can do it justice. Imagine that someone has printed all your memories on transparency film and laid them one on top of another, and now they're holding the stack up to the light. You see all of them simultaneously, not sequentially the way memory normally works, but all at once, each moment superimposed on every other moment, and you are standing in all of them at once and none of them fully. I saw my grandfather. I saw my first week of basic training. I saw Harmon walking toward the chronivore at the Moss River crossing, his back to me, his arms out. I saw Maurice in the pharmacy, a moment before he disappeared. I saw my cot in the rear ward of the hospital where I'm lying right now, writing this, which means that at the moment of absorption I was already seeing this. This moment, right now, the pen in my hand, the ceiling above me, and I was seeing it not as the future but as the present, as one more layer of transparency in the stack. Time inside the anchor's field was not a line, it was a location. You stood in it and it surrounded you in every direction. I kept walking. 10 meters. 5. The pressure in my chest became something physical, something structural, as if my ribs were being pressed by the weight of every second I'd ever lived and every second I hadn't lived yet, all of them equally real, all of them equally present. I held out the coin. I'd been thinking on the walk down about the specific logic of what I was doing. If the coin entered the field while I was holding it, the coin's temporal signature would be mixed with mine, and my temporal signature was a human one, nonlinear, recursive, full of memory and anticipation, and the particularly messy way that human consciousness relates to time, which is to say badly. We are creatures who regret the past and fear the future and are terrible at being in the present moment. The temporal theorists at Oslo had noted, in a paper that I'd read 3 times in the basement during December, that human consciousness was anomalous in the context of chronivore temporal processing, because it was not neatly anchored in the present. A chronivore exists across time, but it exists cleanly, its various temporal positions organized and coherent. A human consciousness, moment to moment, is shot through with non-present time, memory and anticipation and imagination and regret, and this made human beings, temporally speaking, somewhat indigestible, not immune, not safe, but harder to process cleanly than, say, a rock or a building. The grain of sand I was introducing was not just any coin. It was a coin held by a creature whose relationship to time was already paradoxical by chronivore standards, a creature who was, in a sense, never fully in the present moment to begin with. I pressed the coin against the anchor's surface. The surface was not a surface. It was the place where the anchor's field was most concentrated, a zone of such temporal density that matter there existed in multiple versions of itself simultaneously. Touching it was like putting your hand through the surface of a lake. There was resistance, and then there was not, and you were in a different medium entirely. The coin went in. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the anchor screamed. It didn't scream with sound. It screamed with time. Every temporal boundary in the quarry shifted at once, a ripple that went outward and inward simultaneously. The gathered chronivores lurched in their slow, tidal way, disrupted, disoriented, their processing interrupted by whatever was happening at the center. Wren told me later that every instrument she had went to its maximum reading and stayed there for 11 seconds. She said the sky above the quarry turned the color of old photographs for those 11 seconds and then went back to normal. I didn't see the sky, I was inside. What I saw inside the anchor's field during those 11 seconds is harder to describe than anything else I've tried to describe in this account. I was everywhere at once. I was in the field and I was at the quarry's edge with Wren, and I was in the basement in December, and I was in the pharmacy behind Maurice a moment before he disappeared, and I was on the road at the Moss River crossing, and I was here, in this hospital bed, writing this. All of it simultaneously, with the coin in my hand in each version. Or rather, with the temporal signature of the coin creating a loop across each version. The coin that came from inside the field, into the field that contained the coin that came from inside the field. No beginning, no source, the watch breaking. The anchor released. Not violently, more like a hand opening. The compressed temporal signatures inside its field, the extracted people, the displaced people, the ones we thought were gone expanded outward like a held breath finally let out. They didn't materialize in the quarry. Temporal displacement doesn't work like that. They materialized where they'd been extracted from, in the moments just after extraction, which meant they had been gone, and then they were simply not gone. the gap in their presence closing like a seam. We found out later that Maurice reappeared in the pharmacy, 3 minutes after he'd vanished, with no awareness that any time had passed. He was cold and he was confused and he was missing his boots, exactly as reported from Bergen. Yun reappeared in the church, kneeling in the exact position she'd been in when the transit point took her. Sedaris came back 50 meters from where he'd been extracted, which the xenophysicists attributed to his trajectory at the moment of displacement. Harmon, and this is the one I don't let myself think about too hard because it bends something in my chest that hasn't fully straightened since. Harmon came back on the bridge, 40 seconds after he'd walked forward, with no memory of the field. He came back. I only learned all of this afterward, lying in the medical bay of a Corps forward station, where 2 of Wren's team had carried me out of the quarry after I'd been expelled from the Anchor's field, along with everything else it was holding. They said I'd been inside for 11 seconds. It felt like longer. Harmon flew out from his reassignment to sit at the foot of my cot and tell me what had happened, in the careful way of a man who doesn't quite believe what he's saying. "You bribed a god," he said. "I gave it a coin," I said. I wasn't sure it counted as a bribe if the coin just created a logical error in its temporal processing. "And that's different how?" I didn't have an answer for that. The chronivores didn't leave. I want to be clear about that because there's a version of this story that ends with the aliens routing and humans victorious, and that's not what happened. The chronivores are still here. They still move through their territory. They still open transit points and still emit temporal fields and still cause, in their vast and impersonal way, problems for any human who gets too close. But something changed at the quarry. Wren's best interpretation, and she was promoted 3 grades following the incident and spent 6 months in consultation with the Oslo group, so her interpretation carries weight, is that the paradox I introduced created a permanent anomaly in the Anchor's temporal structure. Not a damage, more like a scar, a record of a logical impossibility that the chronivores' collective processing couldn't resolve and therefore had to root around. The routing around manifested as a margin, a spatial and temporal buffer zone that the chronivores began maintaining around human presence. Not much of one, not enough to call safety, but measurable. The temporal washes that had been claiming personnel in our sector decreased in frequency. Transit points began opening at less catastrophic intervals. The chronivores didn't stop existing. They didn't stop being dangerous. They just became, slightly, less inclined to occupy the exact same moment as us. The xenophysicists call it the Mach margin, which I find both flattering and embarrassing. The theory, as Wren explained it to me in terms I could follow, is this. The chronivores are extraordinarily sophisticated temporal processors. They have been at this, presumably, for a very long time. They have a model of linear temporal entities like us, anchored to a single present moment, and their model was built on the assumption that such entities were, from a temporal perspective, simple, predictable, legible. You find them in the present, you process them, you know where they are in time. What the chronivores had not modeled, because there was no reason for them to expect it, was a linear temporal entity that would voluntarily introduce a causal paradox into the most stable temporal structure in their local gathering. Not because the entity had sophisticated temporal capability. Not because the entity understood what it was doing in any technical sense. But because the entity was hungry, exhausted, responsible for people it couldn't protect, and willing to try something categorically stupid on the grounds that it was the only idea available. Spite, Wren called it in her report to the Oslo group, the specifically human capacity for strategic spite. I wouldn't have used the word spite, I would have said stubbornness, or maybe just the refusal to accept the situation as it was presented. We are not, as a species, well adapted to the present moment. We carry our pasts with us in ways that distort our perception. We project anxious futures into moments that haven't arrived yet. We regret, we anticipate, we remember, we imagine. We are not, temporally speaking, clean. And this messiness, this nonlinearity of consciousness, this inability to simply be where we are in time, turns out to be the one quality that a civilization of supreme temporal sophisticates had never encountered in a mobile, problem-solving entity. They are brilliant at time. We are bad at it in ways that make us, from their perspective, deeply strange. Strange enough, apparently, to be worth giving a margin. I've been in this cot for 11 days. Halvorson says another 2 weeks, and I can walk on the leg without the crutch. He says the temporal exposure caused some low-level cellular anomalies that the body will likely resolve on its own. And he says this with the confidence of a man who has read everything written on temporal exposure cellular anomalies, which is to say approximately 4 papers, the most recent of which was written in a hurry and has not yet been peer-reviewed. Wren is 2 wards over and her voice is coming back slowly. The whisper is partly physical and partly, Halvorson thinks, a processing artifact from the 11 seconds of maximum temporal density she experienced even at distance. She sent me a note this morning that said, "Margin is holding. Quarry sector clear for 31 days. Oslo wants a full debrief from both of us when you're mobile." She'd added, in smaller letters at the bottom, "You were right that doing something was better than nothing." I should have said that at the quarry. I wrote back, "You said it might work, that was enough." Because it was. That's the part I keep returning to in the long hours when the ward is quiet and my brain won't stop processing. The plan was not good. The logic was not clean. The outcome was not certain. But Wren had looked at the math, at the theory, at everything she knew about temporal physics, and she'd said it might work. And that had been enough to stand up and walk down a quarry road toward a creature outside linear time with a coin in my pocket. Humans are not, it seems, particularly good at waiting for certainty before acting. We have never been good at it. We have been a species of coin flippers, of bone kickers, of people who look at a closed door and try the handle on the off chance. And in a universe that contains entities for whom temporal coherence is an absolute value, for whom the integrity of cause and effect is not just a useful organizing principle, but the fundamental structure of consciousness. In a universe like that, our messiness turns out to matter. Not because we're better. We're not better. We are, by any reasonable measurement, far less capable than the entities we stumbled into conflict with. We are slower. We are smaller. We are imprecise and temporary and full of the kind of cognitive errors that no chronivore would ever commit. But we are also, apparently, the kind of creature that will bribe whatever god is handy with whatever it has in its pocket, on the off chance that it's enough to get through the day. The coin is gone. It went into the anchor with me and it didn't come out. I expect it's still in there, or in every moment simultaneously, or in a logical loop that has no location because it has no source. My grandfather would probably find this funny. He was a man who thought luck was something you made rather than something you had, and who gave me the coin not because it was valuable, but because it reminded him that value was always arguable. Everything is arguable when you're that hungry. Everything is worth trying when the alternative is nothing. 31 days of margin in the quarry sector. The chronivores are still out there. The work isn't done. But it's 31 days more than we had. I'll take it. I've been asked twice now by corps debriefers who came through the ward with their recording equipment and their polite, practiced expressions to walk them through the specifics of what I did inside the anchor's field. They want technical detail. They want something actionable, something replicable. I understand why. If there's a method, there might be a doctrine. If there's a doctrine, there might be a strategy. If there's a strategy, there's a path forward that doesn't depend on one exhausted corporal walking into a temporal anomaly with a lucky coin. I try to explain that I don't have technical detail. I have recollection, and recollection is imprecise, and this is doubly true for events that took place partially outside linear time. What I can tell them is the sequence. I approached, I entered the field, I introduced the paradox, the anchor released. What I cannot tell them is why it worked, in any terms that would permit a manual to be written. The second debriefer, a younger man, very sharp, name of Castellan, pressed me on this. He wanted to know if I had felt the paradox taking effect, if I'd been aware of the causal loop closing, if there was a subjective indicator of the moment when the anchor's processing was disrupted. I thought about it honestly. There was a moment, I said, where I became aware that everything that had happened and everything that was going to happen were equally present, not a sequence, a simultaneous condition. And then I didn't have a concept of, and then for a while, I said, which I think was the disruption. Castellan wrote this down. I don't know what he did with it. The thing I didn't tell him, not because I was withholding it, but because it only became clear to me in the days following in the slow work of processing the event, is that the moment I'm describing, the moment of simultaneous everything, was not as alien as it should have been. It was disorienting. It was overwhelming. But there was something in it that my consciousness recognized, not as familiar but as adjacent to familiar. Because we already do this in a small way. When you remember something vividly, really vividly, the way you remember a loss or a triumph or the smell of a specific room in a specific year, you're not just recalling, you're occupying. The past is present in you in a way that isn't purely informational. And when you anticipate something with enough intensity, enough dread or hope, the future comes forward into your present in a way that isn't purely imaginative. We leak time as a species. We always have. I was inside a creature of pure temporal awareness, and it should have been completely alien, and it was mostly alien. But there was an edge of it that my human consciousness had already been practicing for, in small ways, for 41 years. I don't know if that matters strategically. I suspect it might. Harmon came back a second time, 2 days after the first visit. He came alone, without the debrief equipment, and he sat at the foot of my cot and looked at the floor for a while before saying anything. "The bridge," he said finally. "Yes." I walked forward on the bridge and then I was standing on the bridge. He paused. No interval, no experience of the interval. I just moved and the moment moved with me. That tracks with what Ren said about extraction. Your continuous experience wasn't interrupted. You just skipped. 40 seconds. 40 seconds. He was quiet again. He had a particular kind of stillness that I'd noticed in him from the beginning of the assignment, not passivity, not calm exactly, but the quality of a man who has learned to let the weight of things settle fully before he tries to carry them. It was a quality I've tried to learn from him and have not fully learned. "What were you thinking," he said, "when you walked down the quarry road?" "I considered this. That the team needed the 40 seconds, I said. That you'd given us 40 seconds on the bridge and I hadn't been able to give anything back for it. That if there was one person who should be absorbing the risk of the next step, it was the person who got to make the decision." "That's not quite right," Harmon said. "No," I agreed. What was also true, and what I was less comfortable saying to the man sitting at the foot of my cot, I had walked down the quarry road because staying at the top felt worse than moving. Because inaction, by that point, had begun to feel like a physical pressure, a kind of temporal displacement of its own, of being stuck in the wrong moment. Because the bones in the commissary depot, the wasted ones, the protein I'd kicked across the asphalt and thought about for days, they'd been replaced in my mind by the 4 people inside the anchor's field, and I could no more have left them there than I could have left those bones in the rubble. That's not heroism, that's obsession. I've thought about the difference and I'm not sure it's as large as we like to believe. Harmon nodded at something he found in my expression. "Right," he said. "They're running you back to command," I asked. "Week after next. They want me for the Southern Sector assessment." He paused. "The MAC margin, they're trying to replicate the conditions. Understand if it can be induced deliberately." "Can it?" He almost smiled. "They found 3 independent researchers who each propose a different mechanism. They're not in agreement on anything except that you shouldn't have survived it. Ren said it might work, I said. She also said it might kill you. It didn't. He looked at me for a long time. No, he said. It didn't. He stood up. Rest. You're going to be in this bed for a while and you should use the time. Doing what? Whatever it is you do when you're not walking into temporal anomalies. He paused at the curtain. Write something. You've always been better at explaining yourself on paper than in person. Leave a record. He left. I lay there looking at the ceiling, the same ceiling I'd stared at for 11 days, and thought, he's not wrong. So here we are. There are things I haven't mentioned yet that I should mention, for the sake of completeness. Halvorsen says completeness is important to the therapeutic function of the account, and I've chosen to trust him on this even though the things I haven't mentioned are the things I like thinking about least. Dumont died 2 weeks before the quarry. I didn't write about it because I kept skipping past it in my head, landing on earlier or later moments, which is probably significant in a way Halvorsen would know how to name. She died ordinary infection from a wound she didn't report because she didn't want to slow us down, which became septic, which became beyond the reach of what we had available in the basement. She was 23 years old and she'd been with the company since the beginning of the campaign, and she had a habit of collecting small objects, buttons, bottle caps, pieces of broken tile, and arranging them in patterns on whatever flat surface was available. She said she'd studied architecture briefly before the chronivores came, and she still thought in terms of structure and space. I have one of her tiles. She gave it to me during the 3rd week in the basement, a piece of pale green ceramic, a corner fragment perfectly triangular. She said it was the most structurally interesting piece she'd found. I keep it in my jacket pocket with the space where the coin used to be. I think about her when I think about the 4 people I was trying to recover from the anchor's field. 5, she should have been 5, not 4, if things had gone differently. But things didn't go differently. The chronivores are impersonal in their destruction, and illness is more impersonal still, and being 23 years old with a future full of shapes she wanted to build is not, it turns out, sufficient protection against either. Aguilar and the others at the top of the quarry got out. They were lifted by a core extraction team 12 hours after the anchor released. After the temporal field in the area had dropped to levels the pilots were willing to fly through. Aguilar is, I'm told, being assessed for temporal processing anomalies following his folding incident on the forest path. The early indications are that he's fine. He told the assessment team that the strangest part wasn't being briefly 2 people. The strangest part was that both of him remembered the same things before the split and had no idea in the moment which one was continuous. I find this philosophically interesting and also deeply upsetting. I'm choosing not to examine it further. The musician, I should mention the musician, because he's become a recurring fixture in my half-asleep thinking. There was no musician. I mean to say, the source film I'm transposing this from, which I haven't named and won't name, includes a scene with a musician and an instrument, a man blowing a tuba who inadvertently propels the protagonist upward, and in the reskinning I didn't have a place for a musician, so there isn't one. But in the long, quiet hours of the ward, I find myself imagining one, a man with a tuba in the ruins of Valkenburg, playing something that doesn't fit the situation at all, a march, a waltz, something determinedly hopeful in the wrong key, the sound carrying through the empty streets and off the limestone walls, none of us listening because we had more immediate concerns, and yet, the sound there anyway. That's not a meaningful image, but it's the one I have. The quarry sector margin held, last I checked, for 31 days. By the time this account reaches whoever reads it, Halvorsen, the debrief team, whoever, I expect the number will be larger. Ren is tracking it from her ward with equipment the Corps rigged for her, and she sends updates every few days in the form of brief notes in handwriting that is getting steadily stronger. Her most recent note from 2 days ago said this: margin now extends to adjacent sectors. Chronivores seem to be treating the quarry site as a temporal anomaly in their own model, a place that generates unexpected causal loops to be rooted around cautiously. Oslo thinks this is significant. They're calling it the first evidence of chronivore learning behavior in response to human action. I think this is the wrong frame. They're not learning about us. They're learning about time in a region where we changed what time does, which is different. I read this 3 times and then wrote back, different how? She replied this morning, learning about us means adapting to us. They see a threat, they model a response. Learning about time means we actually change their environment. They're not routing around us. They're routing around the paradox. We've become, locally, part of the physics. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I don't think it's nothing. I don't know what to do with it either. But it sits in me alongside the tile in my jacket pocket, and the space where the coin was, and the image of the musician who wasn't there, playing something that doesn't fit the situation. We change the physics. Not deliberately, not skillfully, not through any technical mastery or strategic brilliance, through hunger and stubbornness, and the specific human quality of not being willing to accept the moment as it was presented, and not having anything better than a coin to offer as an argument. We changed the physics of what was possible for a city bus-sized entity of supreme temporal sophistication in a limestone quarry in Belgium, because we were hungry and we were tired, and 4 people were somewhere they shouldn't be, and one of them had walked forward on a bridge to buy us 40 seconds, and that seemed like a debt that needed paying. The chronivores will process this. They will adjust their models. They will perhaps root around us with more precision in the future, or study the anomaly more carefully, or do something else entirely that we won't understand until we're already in the middle of it. They are not defeated. They are not gone. They are still out there, existing across time in their vast and impersonal way, and we are still here, imprecise and temporary and full of the past we carry with us. But we're here, 31 days of margin and growing. I'm still owed a coin. Maybe next time I'll have a better plan. Maybe next time I won't need one. I've been thinking about Father Time. The source material I keep circling, the 7-minute film, the strange artifact of another century, has this image in it. An old man with a scythe, walking through an open field. He has the look that artists in 1925 gave to allegory, stylized, symbolic, built to communicate an idea rather than to feel like a person. And the protagonist of that story approaches him and makes a deal. A coin changes hands. Time bends. There's something almost theological in it, which I think the original animators probably intended as comedy. The hungry cat, unable to make ends meet in the present, negotiating with time itself for passage to a better moment. The currency of the negotiation being $1 silver, a modest sum, but all that was available. I have thought about the anchor as Father Time for 11 days. It's not an accurate analogy. The anchor has no face, no will, no awareness of the transaction it was asked to enter. It did not agree to bend time. It simply failed to hold its current shape in the presence of an argument it could not process. But the structural similarity persists in a way I can't dismiss. Something that has been going badly for a long while, a moment of desperation at the edge of an empty field, a coin offered as the only available currency. The coin that my grandfather gave me. I've been thinking about him too. He was a man who had seen several different kinds of catastrophe in his lifetime, who had outlasted them by what he always described as stubbornness, and what I gradually understood was more complex than that. A quality of refusing to accept the narrative that the world was telling him, a habit of looking at a bad situation and finding the absurdity in it alongside the danger, and choosing to live in the absurdity rather than the danger when possible. He used to say that the most dangerous thing a man could become was certain, certain that things were hopeless, certain that there was no angle left, certain that the situation was fully understood. He gave me the coin not as a talisman but as a reminder. Value is always arguable, he said. The moment you stop arguing, you've lost. I wish I could tell him about the quarry. He would have found it funny, I think. Not the deaths, not the displacement, not the 3 months of cold and insufficient food and sustained low-level terror, but the specific mechanism of the solution, the logical paradox introduced by a coin of arguable denomination into the temporal processing of an entity the size of a small building. He would have appreciated that. He was a man who respected improvised solutions. He believed that most elegant solutions were originally improvised solutions that had been cleaned up for presentation. The coin is gone and he is gone, and the anchor is still there in the quarry holding something I can't name, and the margin holds, and here I am. Ren sent me a longer message today, the longest she's written since the incident. Her voice is returning, and so, apparently, is her appetite for comprehensive analysis. It ran to 3 pages, dense with notation, and I've read it twice, and I'll probably read it a 3rd time tonight when I can't sleep. The core of it is this. The Oslo group has now confirmed that the margin behavior is not static. It is not simply a buffer zone that the chronivores maintain because the quarry site is flagged as anomalous. It's dynamic. The chronivores are actively modeling the anomaly, not in the way that intelligence services model a threat, but in the way that a river models the boulder that's been dropped in its path. They are flowing around it, and in flowing around it, they are being shaped by it, and the shape they're being pushed into is slightly different from the shape they were before. Which means we moved something, not defeated, not destroyed, not even deterred in any lasting strategic sense, but moved, slightly, enough to matter. Ren's conclusion, and she uses the word tentatively, which in Ren's analytical vocabulary means she's fairly confident but wants to protect herself from the debrief team's follow-up questions, is that the chronivores have no category for a linear temporal entity that can introduce a genuine paradox. They have categories for matter, for energy, for structured information, for the various ways that non-chronivore beings interact with time. None of those categories include an entity that would deliberately collapse a causal loop inside the most stable temporal structure in a local gathering, for the purpose of recovering 4 absent colleagues and settling a perceived moral debt. This is because, Ren argues, no other entity they have encountered in whatever span of time they have been encountering entities has ever done anything like this. It's not a category they needed. It's not a failure mode they modeled. It's an action so specifically rooted in a specifically human combination of social obligation, logical creativity, and disregard for personal temporal continuity that it could not have been predicted by any model that didn't include all 3 in conjunction. Social obligation. I owed it to Harmon's 40 seconds. I owed it to Maury's who'd been standing next to me. I owed it to Yun and Sedaris, who'd been my responsibility. Logical creativity, Ren's theory about paradox, the grain of sand, the fine watch. Disregard for personal temporal continuity. The part where I walked into the field anyway, despite having no certainty that I would come out, because the outcomes for the others were more pressing than my outcome. None of these 3 qualities, individually, is remarkable. Species develop social structures constantly. Logical problem-solving is a prerequisite for any civilization that can manufacture tools, and self-sacrifice, in various forms, appears in enough contexts that xenobiologists don't treat it as exotic. But the conjunction, the specific combination in a single being operating under pressure, without preparation, motivated by hunger and obligation and the memory of a dead colleague who collected tile fragments, that conjunction, Ren argues, is what the chronivores couldn't model, because they had never seen it before. I read this and lay in the cot for a long time staring at the ceiling. What I thought about was this. We are a species that fails constantly, individually and collectively, to live up to our own stated values. We are inconsistent. We are selfish. We are frequently cruel in ways that have nothing to do with survival. Our history is not a record of virtue. It is a record of catastrophic mistakes interrupted occasionally by moments of something that looks like transcendence only because the surrounding catastrophe makes any upward movement seem dramatic. But we improvise. We carry our dead with us in our decision-making in ways that have nothing to do with strategy. We make deals with whatever's available. We walk toward the thing we're afraid of because staying still felt like the worse option. And the coin in our pocket is the coin we happen to have. And the gap in the physics is the gap we happen to fit. And afterward we lie in hospital beds and try to write down what happened in terms that make sense, even knowing that the terms available to us are insufficient. The carnivores couldn't model this. I'm not sure I can model it either. But I was inside it for 11 seconds, and I came out the other side, and the margin is holding. Halvorsen came by this afternoon with a cup of tea I hadn't asked for, and the expression of a man who has something to say and isn't sure how to say it without exceeding his professional role. He sat in the chair by the window and handed me the tea and looked out at the hospital courtyard for a while. "The debrief team is recommending you for commendation," he said. "Multiple commendations, actually. There's some discussion about what the appropriate framework is, given the nature of the action." "Tell them to save it for someone who had a plan," I said. "Actions don't require plans to merit recognition. They help with the paperwork." He almost smiled. "How are you sleeping?" "In fragments," I said, "but that's normal for me, has been since December." "Are the fragments improving?" I thought about it honestly. The long nights weren't shorter, but they'd changed in character. Less active terror, more something like the process of settling, the way sediment settles in disturbed water slowly, not fully, but enough that you can see the bottom again. "Yes," I said. "Good," he paused. "The account you've been writing, do you feel it's helping?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I feel like I'm getting to the bottom of it. The actual bottom, not just the narrative, that's something." He nodded. He finished his tea and stood up and looked at me with the carefully calibrated concern of a man who has learned to care about his patients without making them feel observed. "Keep going," he said. "You're almost there." He left. I looked at the tile in my jacket, the pale green triangle, and thought, almost there. As if there is a there. As if the thing I've been moving toward has a location. Maybe it does. Maybe the bottom I'm trying to reach is just this. The quarry was cold, and the carnivores were ancient, and the coin was old, and the gap was small, and we fit through it anyway. We fit through it. In the morning I'll ask Halvorsen if I can have a second pillow, and I'll ask Wren by note if the margin is still holding, and I'll eat whatever the ward serves for breakfast without complaint, because whatever it is will be more than we had in the basement in December, and that remains the relevant standard. The carnivores are still out there. We are still here. The coin is gone. The tile is in my pocket. The debt to 40 seconds was paid. That's enough to sleep on.